Today's Washing Tech episode is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at washingtech.com/book. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. And also Warby Parker. Get a free 5-day home try-on at warbyparkertrial.com/Joe. 5 pairs, 5 days, and the try-on is 100% free. That's warbyparkertrial.com/Joe.
It really deprives you of your self-respect and dignity to come onto these platforms and to experience such vitriolic hatred or in some cases like fetishization. Like there's two sides of that coin. You're either being rejected by virtue of a particular characteristic, or you're being sought out because of that characteristic. And in both cases, that's really dehumanizing. Can put people off dating, and dating is pretty powerful when it comes to our socioeconomic opportunities.
Welcome to the Washing Tech Policy Podcast. We deliver the latest tech policy news and brightest tech policy experts to you, wherever you are, so you can stay productive, relevant, and informed in less time. From Washington, D.C., it's the Washing Tech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
Speaker Pelosi announced that she's going to release new net neutrality rules tomorrow. The New Yorker releases an explosive report on Fox News and the White House, and Jevan Hutson is my guest. Hey, everybody. Keep an eye out for a draft of a new net neutrality bill that Speaker Pelosi announced would be released tomorrow, Wednesday. The text isn't out yet, but it's expected to track the 2015 Open Internet Order. A new explosive New Yorker investigative report details the ways in which Fox News has become much more than a news network and more of a White House propaganda arm. Jane Meyer details discussions between the president and White House officials in which the president raged against the AT&T Time Warner merger, and officials considered whether to execute presidential directives to contact the DOJ to file a lawsuit. The report details other ways in which Fox News has in many ways become a propaganda arm of the White House rather than a news network. I mean, if the president is directing the DOJ and illegally interfering with lawsuits the DOJ files, is it really beyond the realm of possibility that he's also influencing Fox News? Probably not. Several U.S. officials said last week that they blocked the Internet Research Agency's internet access as the infamous Russian troll factory attempted to interfere with last year's midterms. The Washington Post reports the operation was the first of its kind after the president and Congress bolstered cybercommand last year. Donald Trump approved the operation. Such a nice guy. YouTube has disabled comments on videos that include minors under age 18. The move comes after pedophiles were lurking in comment sections, directing users on where to access suggestive images of kids. The Federal Trade Commission has won a case against Cure Encapsulations, Inc. for paying a third party to write Amazon reviews of a supplement called Garcinia cambogia. The drug is known to cause acute liver failure. It's the first ever case of its kind at the FTC as the agency seeks to be more responsive to the 21st century, now over 18 years in. Among other reviews, fake reviewers wrote that the supplement literally stops fat from forming and rated it an average 4.3 out of 5 stars. Cure Encapsulations is now liable to pay a $12.8 million fine. So as you know, Amazon backed out of plans to build one of its new headquarters locations in Long Island City. And now, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo is all like, "'Cause I need somebody," trying to get him back. Love is hard. Hard. Representatives from some 70 powerful New York organizations took out a full-page ad in the New York Times to publish an open letter to Amazon founder and CEO Jeff Bezos. Signatories included National Urban League president and CEO Mark Morial and the NAACP's New York State Conference and Astoria chapter, and the presidents of the Queensbridge Houses and Astoria Houses tenants associations. Corporate signatories included Ken Chenault and others. The State University of New York's chancellor also signed the letter, as did the chancellor designee of the City University of New York and the president of LaGuardia Community College. Several unions also signed. In the letter, the signatories characterized the public debate that followed the announcement as strident. It's pretty hard to pass up an opportunity to add your name to a full-page letter in the New York Times. Whether anyone has carefully evaluated the purported upsides of the deal for everyday New Yorkers isn't clear. No word yet from Amazon.
Always be right there.
The Federal Trade Commission has fined China-based social media company TikTok $5.7 million because before it merged with Musical.ly, which at the time was a U.S.-based company, Musical.ly illegally collected the names, emails, pictures, and location data of kids under 13. But the U.S. hasn't fined TikTok for anything that happened after the merger. TikTok has over 1 billion downloads, 100 million here in the U.S., and is seen by many experts as a legit Facebook rival. California Attorney General Javier Becerra is looking to improve his state's privacy law that's set to take effect next year by allowing private individuals to sue companies for damages. The current bill as written allows individuals to take legal action only after giving companies 30 days to correct violations. Catherine Cortez Masto, the Democratic senator from Nevada, is taking on racial ad targeting in a new bill that prohibits companies like Facebook from targeting on the basis of race. ProPublica found back in 2016 that Facebook allows advertisers to exclude racial groups from certain campaigns, a practice which continued at least until the end of 2017. Given today's interview with Jevan Hutson looking at race-based online dating, it may be a good idea for policymakers to include that in the bill. Twitter has suspended far-right activist Jacob Wohl for allegedly attempting to influence the 2020 presidential election by creating fake accounts purporting to support divisive candidates like Howard Schultz. Previously, USA Today had quoted Wohl as saying that he was planning to create enormous left-wing online properties. But Wohl says creating the fake accounts was just an intellectual exercise. Hey, Jacob Wohl, you want an intellectual exercise? Shine my shoes. The Federal Trade Commission has established a new task force designed to look specifically at tech sector monopolies. The task force will boast 17 staff attorneys and be based in the Competition Bureau. Some passengers on a Singapore Airlines flight shared a viral video showing the seatback video monitors in front of them had cameras inside them. Another passenger shared a picture of a similar camera he found on an American Airlines flight. United and Delta followed up saying their screens also contain cameras. All four airlines say the manufacturer ships the screens that way for potential future uses, but that currently the cameras are disabled. Currently. One of the manufacturers, Panasonic, told BuzzFeed that it would never activate the cameras without consent from the airline. So where does the consumer fit here? Seems like maybe their consent should be a factor. Maybe. Just a thought. Events this week. We have a couple. House Energy and Commerce hearing on inclusion in tech, how diversity benefits all Americans, which is tomorrow, Wednesday, March 6th at 10:30 at 2322 Rayburn. And then on Thursday, March 7th, from 9 to 5:30, we've got an event at the FCC, which is located, if you've never been there, at 445 12th Street Southwest. And you can find links to all of these stories and the events in the show notes and also in our Twitter feed. And our handle is at WashingTech. Stay with us. Washington Tech Policy Podcast listeners, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. You can listen at the gym, in the car, or on your morning run. How about The 5 Love Languages, The Secret to Love That Lasts by Gary Chapman? You can download The 5 Love Languages free by trying audible.com. Sign up for your free audiobook and 30-day trial today at washingtech.com/book.
Washington, the inclusive voice of tech policy. Because America won't stand still for the same old insiders. Washington, moving the needle.
My guest today is Jevan Hutson, Gregoire Fellow at the University of Washington School of Law, where he researches technology policy, social computing, surveillance, and privacy and data ethics, and is an editor for the Washington Journal of Law, Technology, and Arts. Jevan currently works for the Technology and Liberty Project of the ACLU of Washington, where he advocates for algorithmic accountability in government and restrictions on government's use of facial recognition technologies. He previously worked for Nintendo of America, Miller, Nash, Graham & Dunn, and Boeing. Jevan holds an MPS in information science and a BA in history of art and visual studies from Cornell, where he was a research assistant in the social computing lab and social media lab. Please welcome Jevan Hutson. I have to admit, I've never used a dating app.
Well, they don't work for everyone.
Well, look, I'm pretty old school when it comes to these things. I've been married 14 years, together for 18. And before that, it was opening lines, excuse me, madam, I believe you dropped your handkerchief. And then you just gradually get to know a person. So I'm pretty basic in that regard. But you took a really interesting look last year into bias and discrimination on intimate platforms like Tinder, Grindr, and OkCupid. And it really revealed some important trends in dating and intimacy that, as you suggested in your paper, really kind of animate the broader discussion around health, wealth, and geography.
That's right.
So let's start with some statistics you uncovered. What does discrimination look like in the world of online dating?
So in our paper, we unpack a number of different intimate inequities in online dating. So to highlight just a few studies, for example, white users of OkCupid are more likely to receive messages or have their messages responded to than their non-white peers, while Asian men and Black women are the least likely to receive messages or responses. White men and women of all ages are more likely to pursue dates with white folks rather than their non-white partners, and are least likely to date outside their race, while Asian and Latino men and women demonstrate comparable patterns of racial exclusion. We also saw that Black men and women are 10 times more likely to message white users on intimate platforms than whites are to message Blacks. And interestingly, this sort of self-segregation in online dating is shown to peak at the first stage of contact. So users are more likely to communicate across racial boundaries when reciprocating than when initiating romantic contact.
And what are some of the trends you've seen on online dating within the LGBT plus community?
So it's the issue of bias and discrimination has been particularly pronounced when it comes to the LGBT community, particularly around how folks use sort of racialized language in their dating profiles. Generally, gay and bisexual men are more likely than their heterosexual counterparts to distinguish between potential sexual or romantic partners on the basis of race or perceived racial identity. Studies have sort of unpacked the ways in which racialized language is leveraged in user profiles. So things like negative discrimination, such as no Blacks or no Asians, or positive discrimination, which I would refer to as fetishization, such as like Black guys are sexy or only into Asian men, as well as marketing self to others. So others might use their race to sort of engage in this sort of racialized selection. And in general, it's been a fairly significant problems for LGBT folks of color. And other folks who are engaging in online intimacy.
So normally I'd go on Tinder and, look at how it's set up, but people would wonder what I'm doing on there. So I have to rely on you to describe how these apps are designed. So you go in and you can exclude people based on race?
Yes, exactly. In our paper, we unpack two different ways that platforms are really generally set up to reify bias. And we look at those in two ways. First, sort of search, sort, and filter tools, and then matching by algorithm. On the first part, of the 25 platforms that we looked at of the top grossing dating platforms in the U.S., upwards of 17 of them include filter tools, which basically allows you to sort of structurally include or exclude people on the basis of a variety of characteristics, many of which are protected characteristics, such as race, ethnicity, or HIV status. And, these design choices reify and also tacitly validate sort of extant stereotypes related to race and other categories. Critically, they map onto historical notions of psychological and physical group difference, whilst also promoting categories as both natural characterizations of people, as well as appropriate axes for determining romantic and sexual disinterest. Sort of secondly, when it comes to algorithms, platforms, generally when you sign up for the platform, they sort of ask about your preferences, and then you can sort of rank those preferences from really important to you or not. And multiple platforms include preferences around racial preference, which in a number of ways, again, still sort of codifies sort of psychological and social group difference in the ways we're thinking like, okay, I'm into this particular type of person, and this particular category has particular characteristics that I can assume of them, which intrinsically is a prejudicial mode of thought and action. And in other cases, as we unpack in the paper, platforms, even if you were to say that you have no racial preference or have no preference with regards to racial or ethnic identity, they will look at aggregate data and say like, hey, well, it turns out that in general your race prefers its own race, and then we'll sort of frame and structure matches based on that. That example came from Coffee Meets Bagel. Unclear if they've fixed the way in which they do their algorithms, but we sort of highlight the ways in which algorithms and these sort of search and filter tools reify extant bias in the intimate marketplace.
So what are the alternatives here? You advocate for some degree of intervention. Is there some middle ground as far as what these platforms can do to mitigate some of the effects of this historical bias that's now playing out on these apps? And which platforms are sort of doing the best job at that?
Mm-hmm. So in general, we'd say that dating and hookup platforms could decategorize and recategorize users according to characteristics other than race and ethnicity. Many platforms provide profile disclosures for other personal characteristics and interests like education, political views, relationship history, or preferences around smoking and drinking. So platforms could characterize users along entirely new and maybe creative axes unassociated with race or ethnicity. And ideally, these new modes of identification or categorization might unburden historical relationships of bias and encourage connection across boundaries. So an example would be the Japanese gay dating app 9 Monsters that categorizes people into 9 different types of monsters. Now, we don't say that this is the necessarily the best way to go about doing this, but it sort of speaks to the ways in which platforms can frame users in different ways that aren't bound up in historical relationships of bias, discrimination, or exclusion. Other platforms that are taking really sort of creative steps around issues of bias and exclusion are platforms like Grindr, which recently released its Kinder campaign, where not only did they sort of unload new community policies that encourage users not to use particular language in profiles or otherwise to exhibit sort of like hateful or racist rhetoric, but they also released this really cool video series that unpacks the experience of particular groups of users, whether they're users with disabilities, folks with HIV, trans folk, or members of communities of color, and sort of unpack what that experience is like to be in online dating facing systematic rejection or bias by virtue of immutable characteristics. And I think it's really important to sort of humanize and center that experience within the intimate realm, because it really deprives you of your self-respect and dignity to come onto these platforms and to experience such vitriolic hatred or in some cases like fetishization. Like there's two sides of that coin. You're either being rejected by virtue of a particular characteristic, or you're being sought out because of that characteristic. And in both cases, that's really dehumanizing and can put people off dating. And dating's pretty powerful when it comes to our socioeconomic opportunities. And if folks are being denied that, that's a problem. But it's good to see that platforms are starting to recognize their role in sort of shaping and framing these interactions, particularly when it relates to historical bias and discrimination.
Mm-hmm. You know, my parents were in an interracial marriage for 41 years. They met in New York in the 60s. He was Irish-American. My mom is African-American, who was part of the Great Migration from the South, North Carolina, Fayetteville, actually, up to the Bronx when she was just 18 months old. And it's only now that I'm beginning to see how radical that was. My parents, it was the height of the civil rights movement, not the least of which were the race riots of 1968, but this was also the bop era in jazz, which brought a lot of people together. A lot of progressive people anyway, and mostly prior to 68, there was a place for people who wanted to prioritize art over race. And I suppose there are signs of that today because, like you said, apps don't work for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. And I generally agree. And I think in ways like dating platforms, I think open that potential for folks to meet people who might not otherwise meet. But sometimes I think it's not to look at as that apps don't work for everyone. Sometimes apps are designed not to work for certain people. And because these design features of dating and hookup platforms sort of shape intimate possibilities that are available to each user, they're able to frame the circumstances within which users evaluate each other as prospective partners and play a role in shaping relative advantages in the intimate marketplace. So instead of thinking apps don't work for everyone, we should think that, no design choice is neutral, right? And when platforms claim that they're neutral, they ignore their role in, shaping interpersonal interactions that can lead to disparate impact, dignitary harms, and systemic disadvantage. So I would say, platform designers really need to abandon this pretense of neutrality in order of promoting overall social good and, trying to reduce marginalizing, fetishizing, or otherwise dehumanizing outcomes.
Well, thanks for holding it down for us, man.
Thanks, Joe. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Now we'll do your icebreaker, and then we'll get to some career advice from you and move to your book pick. Okay, so it's time for this week's icebreaker. Ready?
Let's do it.
What's your favorite meal to cook and why?
Brussels sprouts au gratin. It's definitely the most indulgent way to eat Brussels sprouts because cooking them with shallots in heavy cream and Gruyere is just absolute perfection. Your house or your apartment will smell wonderful for days, and it's an absolute crowd pleaser.
I may start asking everyone this question. I like making pizza from scratch, margarita with some nice basil or arugula on it. I'm usually plant-based, but I got to put a little prosciutto on there too sometimes. So what's your work day like, Jevan? Are you a big planner?
I try my best to have my day planned out, but technology policy advocacy is a dynamic and ever-changing space. So sometimes I have to throw my daily plan out the window because maybe Seattle wants to acquire a new surveillance technology, or maybe I have to rush down to Olympia to testify before a committee in the state legislature, or maybe even the city council on an emergent issue. I'd say regardless, I try to stay grounded in my commitment to protecting communities and making tech fair, and I'm always excited for the problems that come my way.
What are you reading these days?
Well, I just finished my former professor Tarleton Gillespie's Custodians of the Internet, which is a really great deep dive into how platforms police and moderate what we post online, as well as the larger social impacts of those decisions. Gillespie really underscores how content moderation receives not a lot of public scrutiny, despite the ways in which it shapes social norms and has a variety of consequences for public discourse and cultural production. And I think ultimately really highlights how we need to align content moderation with public good, which I think speaks to some of the work that we discussed here today.
Well, thanks again, Jevan, for joining me. Do you have any final ideas you'd like to leave with us before we close? And where can we find you online?
So 2 things. First, the bottom line when it comes to dating and hookup platforms is that they shape access to the social good of love. And because of that, we really need to attend to their architecture to advance meaningful dignity and agency, as well as justice for those who are too often excluded from intimate life. Second, and this is with regards to my tech policy advocacy at the ACLU of Washington, there were 2 really cool pioneering bills in the Washington state legislature regulating the government procurement of automated decision systems, HB 1655, and facial recognition technologies, HB 1654. Both have passed out of committee and are now the fight is on to both strengthen and pass these bills to protect communities and make tech fair. So the extent to which folks can get involved writing to legislators and keeping those discussions, definitely do that. And you can find me at Twitter at Jevan Hutson, Jevan Hutson.
You've been listening to Jevan Hutson, Gregoire Fellow at the University of Washington School of Law. Jevan, thanks for joining me.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
That concludes episode 176 of the podcast. Thanks so much for listening. If you like what we do, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment, head over to Apple Podcasts, give it a review. It helps others know what they can expect from the show and really helps us out. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you back here next week. Take care.
Washington Tech.